Hello, gang. Tattooed Biker here with you. And tonight I've got some reports of what I'm calling upright cryptid canines that I want to share with you. Now, I don't know exactly what these creatures are, be they dogmen, werewolves, or something else entirely. But I found these personal true stories compelling and important to share. So, we're wasting moonlight. Grab your silver bullets and let's ride. Number 1. Hi, Biker. I have some things I'd like to share. You see, we had a house in southwest Florida back in the early to mid-1980s. For over a week, our neighborhood had a series of what I believe were werewolf stalkings. It was June, I think, and around 9 p.m., and I was back out on the patio. At that time, no one had fences around the property, because all of us knew the other families around the area. The only exception was the family across the street from us. They had a 7-foot-tall cinder block wall behind their house. They had a large, wooded piece of property and kept equipment out there. The dad was in construction and the wall enclosed 3 sides of the property. It was hot out with a slight breeze, no clouds and very starry. As I sat there, I could hear the dogs in the neighborhood begin to bark, and then suddenly, everything got quiet. A lone howl started, so I howled back. I do this rather well. I used to watch the National Geographic channel and would mimic the wolf cries. Anyway, this went on for about 5 minutes, and each time the howl from the other end seemed to get closer. Down the road are train tracks that run north to south. The sound seemed to be coming from that direction. I started to get spooked as the howling stopped. Our yard had bushes and a tree on the side where the sound came from. Suddenly, the hair on my arms and neck started to stand up, so I felt like I should go in. As I stood, I heard movement over by those bushes, and I glanced over and saw something move. I didn't wait to see what it was, so I booked it into the house and I stood by the door, which had glass panes in it. I watched as something very large and dark moved about the bushes. It moved away and I could no longer see it from my vantage point. I went over to the front porch to look out the windows, hoping to get a better look at whatever was there, but it never came by that way. So I went to bed and started to read to try and calm down. About less than an hour later, my brother came home. He came into my room and was as white as paper. He was literally shaking all over. His eyes were the size of saucers, and I asked him if he was okay. Now, my brother is the sort that has an explanation for anything unusual, and he's a big guy. So for him to be in this state just wasn't normal. He said, "I need you to come with me right now. I'll explain when we get to the truck." I was still dressed, so I got up and went with him. When we got outside, I asked him what was going on, and he told me there was something in the road by the tracks that he needed to show me first. I wasn't happy about that, as I had just had my own experience with something from that direction. As we got there, it looked like something had exploded all over the road. There was literally blood everywhere, as if something was mowed down in that spot, but there weren't any body parts anywhere. My brother related what he had seen coming down the road. He said, "I was coming home, and as I got closer to the tracks, there was this huge thing lying in the road. I thought it must have been a bull mastiff or a Great Dane in the road, but as I pulled up to it, it didn't look like any dog I'd ever seen. It was hairy, and its head and nose were twice the size of a dog. The body wasn't a dog at all, just dog-like, but much, much bigger. It was all over the place, and there was an arm in the road. Not a dog, a human arm. There was no trace of anything when we got there, and it was only minutes that took us to get there. I said to get the hell out of there now, and we went back home. I told him what I experienced just before he got there. And a couple of days later, my sister came to me and said that she had seen a large dog prowling around at night. It was huge, and she had seen it across the street as she sat on the porch. I told her what my brother and I saw, and not to be outside alone until we could find out what it was. We got together and decided to stake out the yard over the next few nights, and sure enough, it was back in the neighbor's yard. This thing was about the size of a Shetland pony, solid black in color. We had flashlights turned on it, and it took off to the back wall behind the house. Their dog was going off like crazy. They had this small terrier. We watched this dog thing scale the wall. The neighbor came out to see what was going on, and we shouted that there was something in his yard. He ran back in and grabbed his pistol and went around back, but by that time, it was gone. Thanks for letting me share. Signed, Miriam. Number 2. Dear Biker, I decided that I'd like to share some of my grandfather's stories he told me about his time working as a forester in Michigan's Manistee National Forest. He never got the chance to write any of his experiences down, so I thought that I might send them to you. For some background, my grandpa started working in the Manistee area in 1949 when he was only 28 years old. Before then, he'd been drifting around the region, just doing odd jobs and logging, until he was hired by the Forest Service in the northwest part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. The work, as I understand, was slow, and most days he and his crew were sent to different parts of the forest to address tree and land concerns. Grandpa was always an avid outdoorsman, and he enjoyed hunting and fishing just about as much as anyone in that region. Sadly, he died in December of 1998 when I was still rather young, but I remember whenever we went to visit him, he would sit my brother and me down and tell us about his days in the Forest Service. Working outside every day allowed him to witness all sorts of wildlife, like black bear, whitetail, foxes, and even bobcats back in those days. He often relived his encounters with bears while he was deep in the forest, telling us that those moments were some of the most memorable of his life, being up close to such beautiful and powerful animals. Usually his tales were exciting, and the enthusiasm with which he told them inspired us to go out to the backyard and look for animals in between the pines. Although there wasn't much wildlife around their property, they always kept a close eye on us and never let us wander too far from the house. Finally, a few days before his death, Grandpa deemed my brother and me old enough to behold why. I was about 9, and my brother was about 11 when Grandpa first opened up about the strangest things that had ever happened to him. All our childhoods, we had heard him go on and on about the peace that the wilderness brought him, or used to bring him. But this time, his tone was completely different. I don't remember all the details, but I asked my brother to help piece together his story, and my dad as well. He, too, had heard multiple of the experiences in question multiple times. It was the mid-50s. He never gave the exact year. And October had rolled in behind cool autumn breezes and the sound of Canada geese flying south. The first of his strange stories had occurred at night, as he was driving home from a local bar where he and his crew had spent the last few hours after work. It was a windy night, and the pines on either side of the road were blowing. No moon or stars could be seen through thick cloud cover, so only the illumination of the road ahead came from Grandpa's headlights. By his own reckoning, he must have been going close to 50 miles per hour, the moment when something huge leaped across the road not even 20 feet in front of him. His headlights had shown the animal's silhouette. It was dog-shaped, he said, but massive, almost stretching all the way across the road. It only made one bound to get from one side to the other, and its size alone was enough to completely unnerve Grandpa. At the time, he had assumed that the animal was just a very large wolf, except timber wolves hadn't been spotted in that region for decades. He considered it just a bizarre encounter, but nothing came of it that night, and he was able to return home without anything else strange happening to him. Now, the second of his stories admittedly frightened me enough to avoid going outside at night for years. Even now, I'm wary of noises in the dark because of the obvious fear in Grandpa's voice when he told us. Some details here were provided by my dad. It occurred in the same month as his first encounter, only a few weeks later, on a night that was pretty cold for the season. It may have hit 40 degrees, but it was a calm night with little wind. Grandpa's house at the time was really small, and it stood in a lot with about 6 other, similar-sized and built homes. None of his neighbors tended to stay up very late, so it surprised him to be awakened by loud noises at about 1 in the morning. They sounded like scratching on sheet metal, with occasional thumps and bumps, like an animal was trying to get in. Grandpa apparently got up, grabbed a flashlight, put on his boots, and went out into the front room, the walls of which consisted of mosquito screens stretched between wooden framework. Once in the front room, Grandpa could hear the sounds more clearly, and they were coming from the nearest of his neighbors' homes, maybe 50 yards over to his right. It was incredibly dark out there, with no street lights to illuminate. The neighbor's house had a porch light on, but Grandpa couldn't make out what was making the racket through the screen, so he slowly opened the front door and peeked out. He described to us in great detail the animals that he saw there, and he always said he would remember them exactly as they were, for fear brands memories in the strongest. There were 3 massive dogs, covered in long black hair, that were up against his neighbor's house, scratching at the siding and making visible claw marks with every swipe. Each beast, he said, stood about 7 feet tall, with their front legs stretching for another 2 or 3 feet, and easily reaching the roof and the gutter of the house. Their scratching, however, didn't make it seem like they were trying to get into the house, as he explained. He thought they were doing that to get whoever was inside to come out. The next part was actually the hardest to get out of Grandpa. It was strange that he was so eager to tell us everything so far, despite how he felt about the subject, but he was rather hesitant as I remembered to divulge the last horrifying details of this encounter. He claims that the animals then noticed that he had emerged from his own house just across the lawn, for each one turned to look straight at him, just 50 yards away. They had pointed ears like a wolf's and huge bodies that rivaled black bears in their size. They also supported themselves, not with 4 legs like any other native mammal, but instead they stood on 2 legs each, towering 7 feet above the ground. The sounds that they made, Grandpa said, would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It was a shame that he could neither produce recordings nor accurately mimic the unwolf-like screams these animals made, for that detail always fascinated me the most about this story. They didn't sound like foxes, coyote, or bobcats. Instead, they forced half-scream, half-howls out of their jaws that Grandpa was sure held the teeth of a carnivore. He never told us exactly what happened next. I guess we assumed that he ran inside, locked the doors, and didn't look out until morning. He would tell us that 4 of his neighbors, including the elderly couple that lived in the nearest house, didn't stick around very long. He did say that he tried to talk to them about what had happened that night, but they remained evasive and never gave him any straight answers. That turned out to be somewhat ironic because Grandpa himself kept tight-lipped about many of the details of the stories. He would say that he heard those exact screams on at least 2 other occasions, both times while he was out in the forest. And he showed us an old Forest Service report detailing a possible timber wolf sighting in the area, complete with photographs of a huge, padded paw prints in the mud. The thing is, Grandpa never told anyone his stories but his most trusted family, which is unique among Michigan Dogman witnesses. After the craze that Stephen Cook's Legend song stirred in the 80s, it's no wonder that so many stories from the region suddenly surfaced. I had heard a few bits and pieces about the so-called monster before Grandpa told his tale, but it wasn't until later in life that I realized his encounters had to have been with the same creature. Whether I believe him that massive wolves walk upright through the Michigan forest, well, I'm not so sure. But as a modern zoological curiosity, the stories of strange beasts from a passionate woodsman who knew his wildlife certainly remain among the most remarkable I've heard, simply because of the genuine emotion in which he told his stories. I can do is present what I've heard and let others judge for themselves. I, for one, believe them 100% because I knew the man and his reputation. Thanks for letting me share. Signed, Elliot. Number 3. Dear Tattooed Biker, when I was a teen back in the early 2000s, I had a great fascination with werewolves. My uncle told me of this time when he and a friend were driving around Arlington, Ohio, and a creature had walked out into the middle of the road that looked like a big dog, and the back reached the hood of the car, but was longer and had more mass than any dog they had ever seen. He then said it leaped to the side of the road and they drove off quickly. Now at first I called him a liar and said it was BS, but I went down to Florida 2 years ago and stayed with a cousin whose dad is one of my uncle's best friends. One night I was talking to him and said, "Did my uncle ever tell you about the time that he and some friends were driving around Arlington?" And that's when he interrupted me instantly and said a werewolf jumped out in front of the car. Now my uncle hadn't talked to this person for over 5 years, and I hadn't mentioned anything to him about this, so I think he was telling me honestly. I was later told by my dad's girlfriend, who grew up around Arlington on a farm, that something happened to her when she was about 10 years old. She said that her family were all eating supper one night, and they remembered that they had forgotten to feed the chickens that day, so they had to run out and do it after supper. Her dad told her and her younger brother to go out and feed them. They got out into the shed that the chickens were in and heard scratching and clawing at the side of the shed. They both froze on the spot, not moving a muscle. Her dad then walked to the back porch and turned the light on, and he yelled out to them, "When I tell you to run, I want you to hold on to your brother and run for this door, and don't stop until you get to me." So they ran as fast as they could when their dad told them to run. When she'd reached the safety of the house, she asked him why he told them to run. At first, he refused to tell her. So one day, when she was about 16, her father told her what had actually happened. He said that he had seen a shadow of something that reminded him of a wolf on the barn by the shed. He said it was tall, slender, hunched over while standing on 2 legs, and unlike any wolf that he had ever seen. That was all he told her. Signed, Anonymous. And there it is. All I have for you guys tonight. I hope you enjoyed these. Now, whether you call these creatures dogmen, werewolves, or cryptid canines, it's hard to ignore that people are definitely seeing something terrifying and unusual. Thanks for watching. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, Stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker.